Friends of the Gray Institute, this is just a little video piece to complement the blog on the fallacy of training the knee to stay over the second toe. Now, staying over the second toe can also be referred to as over the middle of the foot. And some people even are concerned if it goes too far forward over the toes. But right now we're concerned with the frontal plane motion and whether that knee can and should stay where people have told us it belongs. So let's look at some of the reasons why we said it's a bad idea. First, it doesn't happen in real function. And that's something you don't have to believe me or anybody else at the Gray Institute. You just watch people go out and play and do and walk and reach and bend and lift in. The knee doesn't stay over the second toe. Second, training is going to require conscious control to do that, because you can train someone to be pretty good at that, but when they go out and function, they won't be able to think about that, and therefore it's not going to stay there. That's a good thing, because if it could stay there, that would be a real negative. Why is it a real negative? Because the thing that's going to protect the knee the most throughout the entire body is the powerful hip muscles. Those muscles need to be turned on through movement. And it is indeed the frontal plane motion as well as the transverse plane motion of the bones that produce the motion in the knee. So the lower leg and the thigh are going to go through frontal and transverse plane motions. And too much of those motions could be a bad thing. But the normal amount of those motions are the things that create the lengthening and loading, particularly of the posterior and lateral gluteal muscles that are really the power behind the body, and they're the thing that's going to protect the knee if we train them properly to decelerate the loading motion and then to control it and transform that loading into an explode. So we don't want to get rid of those motions. And finally, we talked about the fact that because the lower leg and the rest of the body is also driven by the foot, if the foot doesn't go through its normal loading motion of pronation when we land, that's really going to mess up the body. But if it goes through that normal loading motion, there's no way you're going to keep the knee over the middle of the foot. So the blog talked about what would practitioners of applied functional science do about that. Well, some of those items are, first, we might utilize normal anatomical drivers of the foot and the arms in order to see how the knee reacts. We have a formal certification in 3D maps that does that. But let's assume we're talking about my right knee. It might be when I did the sagittal plane chains where I do an anterior lunge and look at the reaction of my right knee while I do an arm swing posterior overhead, or I do a posterior lunge and reach down and do an arm swing posterior at ankle. I find out that I'm looking at the knee and it looks pretty good. Then I go through the frontal plane drivers that produce what we call the chains. And what we might see is when I do a left foot, left lateral lunge, trying to create a reaction in the right knee, and I add to that reaction by taking my hands and go right lateral and overhead, we might see that knee dive way, way in. And then we compare it to going the opposite way, the left knee responds pretty good. Well, we'd be worried about that. We'd be saying, wow, the drivers that are creating motion in the frontal plane of knee valgus or too much angulation are also drivers that in this case would reduce the ability of the hip to control that motion. Because when I do this and I create abduction in my right hip, those gluteal muscles we just talked about aren't going to be there to create the control that we're looking for. So I know I have a frontal plane issue, and it might also be indicating that it's those hip muscles that I need to work on. And then I might have seen something in the transverse plane. I might have seen when I do a left foot, left rotational lunge with a bilateral hand at shoulder, arm swing, left rotational, that all of a sudden again I see the knee really dive down and in, something that we're all concerned about. And I compare that to what I see on the left side, and when I do that same motion, I see the knee go through a reaction. It doesn't stay over the middle of the foot because I'm driving it in that direction, but what I'm seeing is pretty good control and not an excessive amount of motion, and certainly looks much better than when compared to the right knee. So I can take advantage of drivers in my assessment to see how that knee is performing and whether we need to work on it. But then the next strategy might be, well, based on that, if I were going to utilize those lunges and reaches, what would I do? Well, I'd start with success. So I'd go to the success that we saw in the sagittal plane, and then I would gradually, taking advantage of chain reaction biomechanics, start to tweak the drivers in order to challenge that knee a little bit more, to increase the demands of the task. So, for example, let's say when I do this lunge and I see that knee dive in, well, I don't have to be mostly in the frontal plane. I could have started with my anterior lunge, which was successful, and gradually tweak the angulation of that lunge, and as I get more success, I'm going to be able to progress the sequence to get back to the place where I didn't have the success. I could also alter what I did with my hands. Instead of going right lateral at overhead, because that really takes out these muscles, I could do that same left foot, left lateral lunge, but instead take my hands this way, which is going to lengthen and load those muscles, and it's also going to create a chain reaction through the body that's going to say to that right knee, one, you don't have to go in as much, and two, we've given you more muscles to control that. Once we continue to utilize the strategy of building on success, we might want to increase the demands of the task. So instead of just a lunge, we might do a lunge with the involved leg, but make it control that. Do a lunge and then control it with balance. So it's something at the Gray Institute we call balance lunge to balance. And finally, once we have success, and we've done that by bringing in more resources with the arms going to the left, we would reduce or tweak out that advantage we gave the body. We would tweak out that resource gradually. So I might be doing this lunge with less of a reach in that direction, then the lunge with no reach, and then I would start to go exactly where the problem was. We take the hands and we start gradually going to right lateral at overhead to take some of that hip control out and still teach the whole body to control the motion at the knee. Why? Because there's going to be times in activities, particularly sporting activities, where when I'm about to lunge and my hand goes over there, that's a real life functional situation that the body is going to have to learn to deal with. So finally, let's think about this. We hear a lot about lunging and squatting, etc., and we say, let's look for the perfect form. And we don't believe there's perfect form, but we do believe there's good form and bad form. And so if we see something and it looks right to our eye, that's probably good form. If it looks bad, it could look bad not only because it could be too much motion, but also too little motion. And so when you start to say, well, what are we looking for in terms of that knee when we do all these different actions, like a squatting or a lunging or a jumping? We're looking for a relative amount of knee motion in the frontal and the transverse planes, the knee diving down and in, not staying over the middle of the foot, not staying over the second toe. How much? It depends on the task that's being attempted. It depends on the movement. It depends on where the drivers are taking that knee. So we can't say there's an absolute amount. We have to understand our chain reaction biomechanics and know that the three-dimensional response of the knee is function specific.